Beneath most cities on Earth, there is water. I'm not talking about a river or a lake, I'm actually speaking about something different, which is harder to see. It's layers of saturated rock and sediment that hold water underground, sometimes for centuries. The name is aquifer, and for billions of people around the world, it's actually the primary source of water they drink, they cook with, and they basically use it every day. You have two types of aquifers. An unconfined aquifer, which sits relatively close to the surface and stays connected to the ground above it. And then when rain falls and soaks into the soil, some of that water eventually reaches that aquifer and replenishes it. And then you have the other aquifer, which is a confined one. By contrast, it is sealed between layers of impermeable rock. The water inside it is often ancient, thousands or tens of thousands of years old, and it recharges so slowly that for practical purposes, once extracted, it just doesn't come back. You see, aquifers form over geological timescales. River deposits sediment over millions of years, limestone dissolves, and then basically the result is a complex underground architecture that holds water in places where none is visible at the surface. And the thing is that in many regions, aquifers are not the backup to other water sources. They are actually the only source available. And as you can guess already, when it's not a backup, then starts this problem that in many of those regions, water is being extracted from aquifers considerably faster than it is being replaced. And turns out nowhere is that imbalance more consequential than in Mexico City. Now, before we continue, do me a favor, press the like button, and if you feel like it, you can press the subscribe one because this helps me a lot. Let's have a look at Mexico City. As you can see, it was built in a high altitude basin, the Valley of Mexico. On top of that was once a lake. The Aztec city Tenochtitlan was actually based as an island inside this lake. Over the following centuries, that lake was drained, and what remained beneath the expanding city was a thick layer of soft, fine-grained clay, and beneath that, an aquifer. That aquifer now supplies approximately 60% of the drinking water for Mexico City's 22 million residents. And no other single source comes even close. This aquifer sits within a broad basin enclosed on nearly all sides by mountains. In principle, rainfall on those mountains should filter down through the ground and gradually replenish the water below, but this aquifer is a bit complex as it's not a single uniform type of aquifer, it's mixed. Near the surface sits an unconfined zone, relatively connected to rainfall and capable of some natural recharge. But deeper down lay confined layers, sealed beneath impermeable rock, holding water that accumulated over thousands of years. And as I read, it's actually these deeper layers that the city depends on most, which is a problem. So in practice, the rate of natural recharge falls far short of what the city extracts. The gap between what goes in and what comes out has been growing for decades. Okay, so I was thinking, why not drop the dependency on that aquifer? Let's just stop extracting water from there and switch to other sources. At first glance, that might sound like an obvious solution, but Mexico City faces a unique challenge: geography. Look at Mexico City again. It sits at an altitude of roughly 7,300 feet. That's about 2,200 meters above sea level. That means any water brought in from lower elevations must be pumped uphill against gravity. If you're trying to supply water for more than 20 million people, this small detail becomes an enormous engineering and energy challenge. But still, I looked it up and there are other high-altitude cities around the world. Cities like La Paz in 3,650 meters above sea level, or Addis Ababa at 2,300 meters above sea level. However, they are located near mountain watersheds, rivers, or regions that receive substantial rainfall, while Mexico City is different. Bottom line is that now Mexico City is in real trouble. However, they already depend on one of the most ambitious water transfer projects on Earth, the Cutzamala system. This vast network of tunnels and canals and pumping stations transports water from sources located more than 100 kilometers away. Even more impressively, much of that water must be lifted over 1,000 meters in elevation before it can even reach the city. But lifting billions of liters of water every day, year after year, over mountains and across long distances requires enormous amounts of electricity and infrastructure. The system consumes a significant amount of energy simply to overcome gravity. This is why importing more water is not a simple long-term solution. Around the world, cities facing water shortages often turn to a combination of strategies. You can recycle wastewater, you can reduce consumption, or just replenish underground aquifers. But for Mexico City, no single solution is likely to solve the problem. The city's immense population and high elevation and aging infrastructure and declining groundwater reserves combine to create one of the most complex urban water challenges in the world. So now you know, but what does all of this have to do with the sinking of the city? The first recorded evidence of Mexico City sinking dates to 1925, when engineers noticed the surveying benchmarks, which are fixed reference points that used to measure elevation, mysteriously dropped below their original positions. It was a very small movement at the time, just a few centimeters, so I guess back then no one stopped to think about this. But in the centuries since, the city has sank by an average of around 10 meters in many areas. In some districts, I understood the total is even closer to 15. And yeah, now you probably understand the reason for this mystery. If we look again what lies beneath the city, we know that in this Valley of Mexico was once a lake system. But when the Aztecs built Tenochtitlan, they were constructing on water. And as the lake was progressively drained over the centuries, it left behind an unusual deep deposit of soft lacustrine clay, and that's a compressible sediment that had just basically accumulated on the lakebed over thousands of years. Now this clay is the central material in this story. And then add to that the fact that the groundwater is still being pumped from the aquifer, and so water is removed from the spaces between soil particles. With that internal pressure gone, the particles move closer together and this soil compresses, which results in the surface above them dropping. So that's one reason, should be enough. But add to that the second factor that compounds the problem, the ever-increasing weight of the city itself. Its building, the roads, everything. It all presses constantly down on that same compressible clay. That settling puts stress on buried pipes and foundation, and then the pipes crack and leak, which means more water needs to be pumped to compensate. More pumping causes more settling, and by today, the damage this has produced is visible throughout the city. The Metropolitan Cathedral in the historic center, for example, one of the largest churches in the Americas, has settled unevenly. You can actually see its tilt with your eyes. So what happens now is that engineers are constantly trying to stabilize it. This is a truly frustrating reality for the citizens of Mexico City. Let's leave Mexico City for a second. Going back to the early 90s, scientists began noticing something strange. When they compared radar images of the same locations taken from space at different times, they discovered that Earth's surface wasn't nearly as stable as it appeared. Entire regions were slowly rising, sinking, stretching by really tiny amounts that were completely invisible to people on the ground. You can't see it by yourself, but you could see it from space. And the breakthrough came from a technique that was called interferometric synthetic aperture radar, or NISAR. By comparing radar signals collected during multiple satellite passes, researchers realized they could detect incredibly small changes in the position of Earth's surface. So for the first time, it became possible to watch the ground move from space. The implications were enormous. Scientists began using the technique to study earthquakes, for example. In some cases, they could actually see how the ground shifted after a major quake. They used it to monitor volcanoes, watching the land slowly swell as magma accumulated beneath the surface. They tracked landslides, glacier movements, and so on. But there was a problem because most satellites capable of performing these measurements were never designed to monitor the entire planet continuously. They provided snapshots rather than a complete systematic record. Researchers often had to wait weeks or even months just for another image of the same location. And then as years passed, climate change was accelerating in all its shapes and forms. Scientists needed a satellite designed from the ground up to monitor change on Earth. A satellite whose primary purpose is to manage how Earth itself moves and changes. And so NASA and the Indian Space Research Organization announced a joint mission. That is to build a spacecraft capable of repeatedly scanning nearly the entire planet and measuring tiny changes in Earth's surface with extraordinary precision. The project became known as NISAR. Unlike traditional satellites that rely on visible light, NISAR could use radar. That meant it could operate day or night through clouds, smoke, dust, whatever you can think of. Once in orbit, NISAR would repeatedly revisit the same locations around the globe, building an ever-growing record of change. And now back to Mexico City. For most of the history of the city's problem, subsidence was measured in the way it was in 1925. Engineers placed benchmarks in the ground and returned periodically to see how far they had moved. The method was accurate, but it was kind of limited because you could know what was happening at the specific point, but not across all the city. So you couldn't really map the full pattern of the movement or give a complete picture of where this risk was happening. Satellite technology, and specifically NISAR, changed that. Its precision is such that shifts of a centimeter or even less are detectable. Applied to Mexico City, the data has provided the clearest and most comprehensive picture yet of how the city is moving. So now we have a detailed map showing rates, patterns, and variations across different parts of the urban area. What the data shows is that subsidence in Mexico City is neither uniform nor random. Different areas are sinking at significantly different rates, and those rates correspond closely to the underlying geology. In the worst affected zones, measurements indicate the surface is dropping at more than 2 centimeters per month. That amounts to roughly 25 centimeters per year, or more than 2 meters over a decade. How crazy is that? The districts built on the deepest, softest lakebed deposits, like parts of the historic center and the eastern districts, show the highest rates of movement. The Benito Juarez International Airport is among the more striking example. Airports, I think more than anything, are particularly sensitive to ground movement because of the runways, it needs to be flat. Now this airport has sunk substantially over the decades since it was built, requiring ongoing resurfacing and structural attention. This is such a problem that there's actually a newer international airport built to the north on more stable ground as a response to the long-term constraints of the original site. And the most famous evidence Mexico City has to offer right now is the Angel of Independence. This monument, built in 1910, was designed with a short staircase leading up to its base, about 9 steps. As the decades passed and the ground subsided, they had to add steps to maintain access. That process has been repeated multiple times, and today 14 steps were actually added, bringing the total to 23 steps leading up to the base of the Angel. There's a structural contradiction at the center of Mexico City's water situation. The city extracts groundwater to meet demand. By current estimates, around 40% of the water pumped into the distribution network leaks out before it reaches any tap. To compensate for those losses, the city must pump more. More pumping causes more subsidence. More subsidence damages more pipes. I imagine this situation as being like a man stranded at sea, drinking seawater to stay hydrated. As I understand, engineers working on the city's water infrastructure are largely not solving this problem in any durable sense. They are just managing it. They repair stuff, but If the ground beneath them continues to move, the same things need to be repaired again and again. What Mexico City provides is a long-running, well-documented case of a sinking city. And as the aquifer continues to decline, I think to myself, how will this situation be resolved? So the most likely outcome is not that Mexico City will suddenly collapse and get swallowed by earth or something like that. That's what I thought, but no, that's not the answer. A possible outcome is that instead the city will enter a long-term struggle against the consequences of its own growth. Water will become more expensive to supply, infrastructure will require constant repairs, and more resource will be devoted to simply maintain the systems that keep the city functioning. And over time, the cost of keeping Mexico City running will continue to rise. Whether there's a point at which those costs become economically unsustainable remains an open question. But every year, more resources are being spent not on growth, but actually on fighting the consequences of the city's own subsidence. And meanwhile, as the days pass, the Angel of Independence stands there with his new steps. The cathedral continues its slow managed lean, and the monitoring satellites pass overhead every 12 days, measuring a city in motion.